So I figured I'd take a step back and approach a new video for the sake of a comparison. And obviously, if you're here, you're wondering a little bit more about Affinity Designer or Photo or one of the Affinity Serif apps, and helps, at least from a new designer or someone who's interested in these apps, from a perspective of comparing it to another app. So chances are you might be coming from Adobe Illustrator and wanting to see what all the fuss is about for Affinity Designer. Besides the iOS apps, the desktop apps have been around a while now, and they're actually very comparable in features, as well as just the kind of workflow you might be used to from someone who might be coming from Adobe Illustrator. So I was that kind of person. So from that perspective, I've come from Illustrator and wanted to see if I could make use of Designer and maybe save a few bucks in the process, because Illustrator and Photoshop and those apps are on that SaaS model, and you need to pay a monthly fee of like 50 bucks at this point in time to use those apps day to day. So you basically need to be a professional or have your company pay for something like that, because that's a pretty big investment long term. Besides all of that underlining details, the advantages from each app differ a little bit. Most cases you come across when maybe trying out Designer might be getting used to the terminology at first. So a lot of things are very similar in terms of features and tools, but they are either just spelled differently or have different naming conventions. So for instance, a outline in Adobe Illustrator, an outline path or shape or stroke or something is known as curves in Affinity Designer. So those things just take some getting used to, but over time I've found, at least for me, I'm completely okay with it. It's been a tool that I've been easily adaptive to based on my workflow that used to happen in Illustrator when I got started in design. Which, Illustrator used to be basically what there was. So now there's all these new tools, and Designer's a great candidate for a replacement, in my opinion. Maybe you'll think so too after this when we compare more. So under the hood, there's some general settings for each app. If you go to, say, the preferences of Affinity Designer, you'll see all these tools in their own little UI buckets. So general, color, performance, user interface, tools, shortcuts, miscellaneous. The features here are a little limited comparison to Illustrator, but I think that's okay. I think they strip back some of the stuff you don't necessarily need to tweak on your own. I mean, obviously there's a ton you can tweak, but it's one of those things that I think they saw as a edge case and wanted to make a little trimmed down compared to Illustrator. So let me open up Illustrators to show you what I mean. There's tons of settings here that is just for general stuff. There's selection, type units, guides. You can change the color of your guides and all that. Smart guides, all those things. And with Illustrator, you can have plugins too. That's something that I think Affinity Designer lacks at this point. But I don't personally use tons of plugins on my own, so it's not a huge deal breaker. I'll get into the user interface customizations in a second, but this is going to be just an overview of the actual general settings. You can configure a lot more in Illustrator, and you'll notice there's tons of tools using that mantra. So I don't think it really, unless you use it for a specific purpose other than illustrating, it's one of those things that you probably only use a handful of its features, comparison to Designer, where you probably use most of the tools here, which are pretty generalized, things you would actually use. So that's something to keep in mind. Going into more detail, if you go into viewing modes, one of the big things with Designer is that there is an outline mode, which is a cool one, and there's also a split mode, which is new to just this app. So basically you can compare pixels versus vectors in this particular document, and the same is true in Affinity Photo. If you're using that app too, there is this view where you can just see kind of a before and after on many effects you apply. Illustrator doesn't have anything like that, but it does have outline mode. I believe it is view. Yeah, it has an overprint, pixel preview, and all the like. So it's very comparable in those regards. But I think the one that wins is the outline mode in Affinity Designer, which just allows you to see any vector paths that you have created. That this is obviously an image in the background, so it's not anything I'm going to see the paths of, but it's one of those things you can see as you go when you start to actually draw things in this program. Yeah, aside from that, we did just quickly go over to the settings. You can go and tweak the interface for Affinity Designer. In the latest release, it only used to have a dark UI. Now there is a light, so you can configure that to happen and update like so. And I think Illustrator beats Designer in terms of just having more options for tailoring the interface. You can have 4 different view modes that just adapt to what you want to work with. You can also configure the canvas color to match the actual document based on your settings. So it's just kind of a nice adaptive setting to go about. Other than that, it's just one of those things. It's very focused on your own personal preference. So just feel free to tweak those to your needs. I prefer the dark mode personally, but that's simply because it's a little easier on my eyes. I'm often on a screen most of my day, so I think the dark mode really helps with that. When you are creating a new document, create a new one in Illustrator first. Go to New. I greet it with this panel, and basically it'll show you what's nice. It'll show you your recent documents you created, which is it's convenient. I like that about it. Designer doesn't have anything like that, but it does have presets. So on the right here, this is Illustrator's version of presets, which gives you a nice indication of what device you might be using if you're on mobile. Web too, if you can see the icon. Print, film and video, and art and illustration, which is a nice one. It's everything's set in points here, which is a good thing to have in your arsenal, so you don't have to constantly create these things from scratch and have to research what sizes to use. The film and video one's unique to me because I know Affinity Designer doesn't have anything like this, but it does have presets, a lot of presets for web, probably more than this. So we can look at that real quick. You create a new document. So obviously the new document panel isn't as nice to look at, but it does the trick, and it has all these page presets for any particular use case you might need. So all these here. Photo, for instance, has actual presets for the sizes and the ratios. A nice thing to have there in your arsenal. That's something I don't think Illustrator has. Sizes for web, all these different variants. And then, of course, the devices here, which are nice. They actually just call out actual phones and iPads and stuff as opposed to just saying a certain size, which is nice. So I would say they both have their pluses and minuses in that use case. So I would say either or you can use and get by. So artboards in both apps are very similar. You can create using an artboard tool, for instance, in Affinity Designer, just by clicking that tool, dragging a new artboard out, and creating it like so. I didn't have one set up for that one particular, so this is just a brand new artboard. If you want to create a new artboard again, you can either just insert it as the current document size, which is set here, and just click Insert Artboard, or you can actually create a template. So maybe we'll use iPhone X and insert that. And so there you go, you have one ready to go. As far as I know, you can have unlimited artboards in Affinity Designer, and I've heard from many folks that it doesn't hiccup based on a huge file size, which is a great thing. The opposite is true for Illustrator. I've heard the bigger your file size gets, the more it's probably gonna crash. So it's something to keep in account because there's so much going on under the hood. So creating an artboard over here would be using this tool. And when you do create a new document, an artboard already exists, which is a feature I'd like. I wish that happened in Designer, but it's something that isn't a huge issue, but it might be something that's just kind of annoying. But you can, again, drag a new one out here. I do like the guides and everything it gives you, and as well as the handles in Illustrator. But you can name each artboard in this setting. I think I prefer Designer's naming case, so it's actually a layer in your layers panel. You can rename it here, as opposed to Illustrator, you can rename it up here. So it's one of those things. There are more settings in terms of the artboard. You can add a center mark, show crosshairs, stuff for video if you want. I don't really use those personally because I don't work in a lot of video, but that is something that is useful to many, I'm sure. I do like the crosshairs here on the actual artboard itself too, because it reminds me of an actual print press document. There's like actual cropping going on, or bleed, so to speak. So that's nice. But yeah, creating a new artboard just exists like this. You can use a custom one here, or look at all these presets you can access. So obviously Illustrator's a little more feature rich here, but they both do the same task pretty well. Okay, so color picking is one little quirk in Designer that took some getting used to for me. So by default, you have a shape here. Maybe you want to just make it a specific color, or maybe I'll make it a random color, but I want to get the color code off of that and use it somewhere else, maybe on another shape that's not this color. So I'll just put one here and make it that red or something. I'll just do this. So I have these two shapes and I want to make one the same as the other color. So maybe I'll make this shape the red that we have there. So to do that, you have to actually go drag, click and drag from that eyedropper tool, hover over the element you want to pick, let go of your cursor, and then go to this shape, make sure it's selected, and then click this color here. So to me, that's quite a lot of clicks just to get that going. Illustrator just works like you think, and that's one thing I miss from it. So if you make a shape, we can do the same thing here. Maybe I'll use squares. Okay, so I want to make the red square blue. How about that? And what we can do is go up to the color picker tool, and we want to select that layer and make it this blue, and it just automatically updates. So it's something that, like, I don't understand completely why they chose this kind of UI flow or UX flow to create that same experience, but I think Illustrator is way more intuitive in terms of color picking. So you just literally, I want to make this square that blue, you go to the color picker, color pick that, it updates automatically. And then in this case, you have to go above and beyond. So say I want to make this circle red. So we'll pick that red color. It looks like it was already picked there, so that's how that worked. But if we pick that and then click that, so it's 2 clicks compared to the 1. It's one little quirk I'm not 100% on, but I have learned to adapt to this, and it's okay, but I wish it would do what Illustrator was doing. So in terms of paths and joining shapes, I would say Illustrator is a little more feature rich. It's known as Pathfinder on the Illustrator side. So if you go into your window and Pathfinder, you can actually pull up an actual dialogue, which is useful. I know that you cannot actually pull that up in Designer. It's not an actual widget or dialogue, so it's something you have to actually deal with from the contextual menu toolbar. So you have 2 shapes, say you want to join these. Maybe I'll make this one a circle. And they're 2 separate shapes at this point. I want to just kind of put them together. Obviously they're 2. If you go up here, there's this new geometry toolbar that we're going to use, and this is what is known as Pathfinder in Illustrator. So if you're coming from there, this is that same thing, but it's a little less in terms of features. You'll notice Pathfinder has the shape modes as well as different path modes. So there is unite, minus front, intersect, exclude, divide, trim, merge, crop, outline, and minus back. Here it's just add, subtract, intersect, divide, combine. So to each his own in terms of these tools. I think this is plenty to get me to where I want to be, but it's something that's just different when you're coming from the other app in terms of terminology as well as just how things behave. But essentially they work the same way. So if I wanted to join those paths, this is now one shape. And you notice it's called a curve now instead of like an outline or shape or path or something as it might be called over here. So that's something to keep in mind. When you want to edit these points though, you can just double click that shape, click and drag, and scale different curves, all those things, which is, we'll get into the pin tool here in a second, which is, I think, a huge reason I love this tool compared to Illustrator. To just show off what the Pathfinder features and geometry features are comparison. Affinity Designer is great with this. It has the ability to give you preset colors as well as a bunch of Pantone color books, which is great, and you can use your system colors as well. But by default, there is support for adding different palettes of your choosing based on either the application, the document, or the system. So if it's the application, it's going to be a new color palette within this Affinity Designer app. So if it's a new document, it's only within that document. So you see it's scoped to those specific things. And then your system, you can make that available to all your other Affinity apps, which is great. So you can create that and have it just shared between apps and just be ready to rock and roll in that regard. So creating one is pretty simple. If you come up to this drop down arrow, hit add document palette. It's called unnamed by default. I wish it prompted you to name it first before it did this, but it's a small little thing that you just get used to. But you can rename it from that drop down menu. So I'll just say document palette. So now we have document palette, and within that we can create some swatches or just add those ourselves. So you would actually select a color in your foreground color and then click this icon here. It says add current fill to palette, or you can create a global palette, which is another awesome perk of Affinity Designer, I think, which is a color that updates automatically if you update it again on multiple objects. So I'll create one and then I'll use, say, this blue color to be a global. And you'll notice the little triangle on the bottom left represents the global color. So say I created a few shapes and they're currently our global color and they're set with that. You can see by the icon there. So I'll just go ahead and set those, make sure they are for sure. And then let's say I wanted to update this color to a green. You'll see that they update in real time, which is great. So if you have multiple things and your client comes to you and says, hey, how about we update this color to something like this, you know, immediately you can get that change done in just a few seconds, as opposed to just going through, highlighting each layer that you need to update, changing that color, saving it, hoping for the best, hoping they, you know, commit to that color. So this is just a quick way to go about that and make it really increase the productivity of your workflow. So Illustrator has similar features. It has so many color books and properties to choose from, but unfortunately it's not as feature rich in terms of the saving the document library. So you see all these over here. Sorry if that's cut off. But there is all these libraries you can choose from that have tons of swatches. But one thing that's nice about it is you can see different views as well. And they offer a lot of different ways to view each color, which is useful if you need to identify different color codes on the regular. But there's all these different views and concepts you can go by. You can sort by different names or kinds, etc. Something you don't get in Affinity Designer. But personally, I would much rather trade the document palettes or application palettes, system palettes for these features. I don't need these per se. Illustrator does have spot colors as well, so you'd have to actually go ahead and integrate those. So that's a nice perk. You can export your swatch as an ASE or AI file and use it in another app or send it to someone else who uses Illustrator too. The same is true for Affinity Designer though. You can export each palette and use it elsewhere. You can even import it as a different kind of palette. If you use, say, export a document palette and then want to import it as a system palette, it's totally possible. So I think color management in Affinity Designer is what I wish all the apps had, and I'm hoping people see more about, you know, the power behind that. I find it extremely useful, especially when illustration, if you want to create certain colors and have access to palettes and just want to make it quick to grab a color, you know, create some object or shape, you can totally do so in a very quick and easy workflow. The general tool vibe of each app is certainly different. Affinity Designer, of course, has what I would say more or less the realistic tools you'll use more often. Illustrator has so many under the hood that you might not even use some. Like, I don't know, the last time I used a column tool or chart tool to create, you know, a graph like this, but it is baked in and it's useful, I'm sure. I just don't necessarily resonate with that in my own work, but it's something that maybe you would use it for and, you know, find that feature useful. Illustrator is definitely catered to every specific use case that many users would have, as opposed to just Designer, who is focused on creating an app for people who design and create illustrations or UI designs, etc. So one thing that's different between the two, obviously Illustrator has more tools, but I like the fact that a Designer has many shape tools by default, and these are going to be configurable based on what you create. So the trapezoid, for instance, has its own contextual tools or settings per shape. So all of these would have their own in this drop down here, and you can tweak those to your liking just by dragging from those points. And then you can also, with any shape, convert it to curves and just really customize it at that point to your liking. So you can drag each shape by its nodes and do what you will with it. So it's kind of nice, very powerful. So I often find myself reaching for these custom shapes to save a lot of time in creating them by scratch, which is something you would have to do in Illustrator. By default, there's only about 6 types to start with. And while they're useful, I find them to be limiting in terms of if I needed, you know, a certain abstract shape, I really have to invent it out of thin air, as opposed to just creating something similar from this panel and going from there, as opposed to, you know, just from scratch. So on top of the shapes, one little quirk I like about Illustrator is when you do select any of these shapes and just click once on your document, you are greeted with a dialog. I think that's super powerful and nice in terms of maybe you're creating some UI design and you want to create a button of a specific height and width that you already know in your mind needs to be. That's something I find super useful. Here, we don't have that feature. In fact, you click and it doesn't really do anything on the first click. It's assumed that you need to click and drag to create the shape, which is, it does what you would expect, but it's something that I wish was also ported over. So that's something you might not be used to, that you would have to get used to from Illustrator to Designer. Illustrator's main shapes, while they have some settings per shape, they're not completely configurable like they were over here for, say, like a star. For instance, if I created a star, you can see I can go up here and edit the inner radius, can edit the points, all these things real quick without having to grab any pen tool or node tool and just go to town. I find that super awesome and useful. And here we can adjust the shape, you can adjust the width and height, transform all those things, but in the end, it's still limiting to me. Okay, so text in Affinity Designer is a little cumbersome compared to Illustrator. I really like Illustrator's text tool. There's a ton under the hood by default, but the one that you really need to focus on is the basic type tool. With it, you can actually just type text by clicking and dragging. You can create a line of text just by doing this and, you know, type. So text is pretty powerful in Illustrator. There's so many tools under the hood that you can grab and do things with. So you can type on an area, you can type on a path, an actual vertically typed tool, which is a nice one to have. That's something that isn't in Affinity Designer. But you can type on shapes and paths and everything else in Affinity Designer. You're gonna have to reach for the artistic text tool for that. So that allows you to basically, you know, type like as you would. So Affinicasts, something like that. Or you can type on an actual shape just by creating the shape first, and then you'll get this new cursor when you hover over the boundary of that shape. It's going to lose its fill when you type, but you can still go to town doing so. Bump up the size. So one thing that I love about text in a Designer and many of the other features is that I'm just clicking and dragging and hovering over these settings and it's all updating in real time. That doesn't happen over here. So that's something that I really loved about the app when I first opened it up and started playing around. It does work when you update the font. So over here, you'll see the fonts update in real time, but it does not update when you do things like this. So if you're in this drop down and you hover over, you notice nothing happens until you actually select an item, which is kind of nice that you know that that is that setting. But at the same time, I really love the gracefulness of the auto updating inline for this. And it just happens with everything you do. So it's pretty neat. So you can type on paths in Illustrator as well. Type on shapes inside of shapes, I should say, on Designer. So you can as well with Illustrator, but I would say Designer is a little limited in terms of its offering, but it does give you enough, I would say, to do what you need to do. So if we get the frame text tool out, you can see a new icon here that appears that allows you to type within this boundary. So I'll just insert, go to layer or text, insert filler text. You can't see this, but that's what I'm doing. And you'll see some filler text just, adapt to this shape, which is super useful. The same is true over here. You can go ahead and do that in the actual tool for the area type tool. Does the same thing. So you need an actual shape to go ahead and do everything to, and it'll tell you if you don't have an actual shape bound to that you need to create one. But that's the same principle in theory. One quirk I'd maybe not loving is when you do create some text on a artistic text tool, I'll just do some gibberish for now. But basically, at this point, this text can't be converted to frame text, but it does scale when you do click and drag it. So if you wanted this to be, actually break where you have paragraphs, you unfortunately need to use the frame text tool from the start. So you can go and click and drag, have that bounding box, and then go ahead and add some text there. So let me insert some again. So you'll see it breaks where you want it to, and then you can actually scale this and it'll conform to that boundary, which is nice. I wish that was just all within one tool, but I understand it probably needs to be separate just because of all the edge cases involved with typography. So again, I think to iterate, the niceties of Designer is the real-time updating of pretty much anything you need to do with your type in an actual document. So I'll insert some more text here. So if we were to edit these settings, say I want some larger text, maybe I'll do a quick different font, Baskerville perhaps, and you can adjust the formatting, all these things, all updates in real time, which is super useful. And then you can go further in the typography panel and adjust that. So if we'll go to, looks like I might have it open, character panel, here we go. So within this panel, we can adjust even more settings in terms of positioning to actual typography, have all these ligatures and everything going on. If we need them, all that stuff happens in real time, which to me takes the cake. The next huge thing that made me really consider switching from the very start was to get into the pen tool. The pen tool from Illustrator is pretty much, I think, where everyone falls in terms of the illustration category. It's how you create anything your mind is after, and it does all these niceties when you do create a path and just join points and all these things. At this point though, there's so many tools you need to use to illustrate in Illustrator that it's kind of a cumbersome experience, because you need to make the shape with the pen tool, then you need to go up to the node tool, or I think it's called, what do they call it here? Direct selection tool, and then modify those points. Say you need to create a new point. Unfortunately, you need to go grab a pen that has an add anchor point tool, add that point, and then you can go back, edit that point with the other tool. So you find yourself hopping from tool to tool, and while it works and it can totally be doable, that process is mind-numbing and also just cumbersome. So on the Designer side, you can actually do everything with the single pen tool and the node tool, and that's it. So the great thing is you can just start plotting points and just go to town however you want to do it. Join that path. So from there I can grab the node tool or continue with the pen tool, but from here I can just go and do all these things without having to go grab another tool. So I can add a point by double clicking, can grab this handle, do that, This shape is completely abstract, but it's just showing by example. And then at any point, you can just come up here and convert or do a different action on it. It's completely up to your creativeness, basically. So I think in terms of the pen tool, Affinity Designer has got a great solution here. I find it to be super intuitive in terms of the user experience behind it. And I think that creating abstract shapes comes so much easier in this app compared to Illustrator, as the software doesn't get in the way, which is the main thing I found to be why I've come over to Designer and Photo for permanently in terms of my workflow, in terms of illustration and photo editing and stuff like that. So it's the lighter software, the stuff that doesn't get in your way, that affects your creativity, is what ultimately makes a design app a good one, in my opinion. So I think the pen tool is the perfect candidate to show that off in this case. So definitely check that out if you have not yet. Just start plotting points, maybe draw something, and just see how more fluid it is and easy it is to interact with. So there's caveats with everything, but I think you can just go and make the best of it. I find this experience just kind of completely fluid compared to what I used to do in Illustrator, which is a big reason I've come over here. So here I'm just kind of doing almost like a silhouette of some figurehead there. We need a little point for the nose that comes out a little far. So something like that, it just kind of really embellishes what this tool can do. It's rough, but something like that. Besides all the extra features, which I won't go into because this is probably a very long video at this point, but I think exporting is a big one that, again, Designer is going to be killing it at. And why is that? Simply because there's a whole persona called export persona. And if you're new to Affinity apps, there's these things called personas that do completely different things within the same app. So you don't have to leave the app to go do something else. For instance, if you want a pixel type of edit in your vector document. So we won't talk about the pixel persona in this video, but the export persona is something you can treat and do as you will with. So say I wanted to export this designer icon, I can just grab and select a slice, go up and just do that. Resize it to about the same size. You've got the new slice here. By default, it's going to give you an export preset of PNG, but there's so many others you can do, and you can batch export as OSX icons or iOS icons. So you get this huge bundle of icons that you would normally have to do by hand, which saves you so much time. By default, you have your layers here for each thing, and your artboards are going to show up by default in the export persona. And I should mention before I keep going, I do have videos on this persona on Affinicasts that you should check out if you want to know more. So definitely check those out. This is assuming you know a little bit about this persona. So from a slice perspective, if you go into this drop down, you can add all of these different types when you do export it. It's an image by default, so some of these don't make sense, like SVG or EPS, but it is possible to export. And so if I wanted to create a low quality version, a high quality version, say I'll do the best quality of the JPEG, add another variant that's twice the pixel density, so 2x or 3x. You can even go into these other sizes here, and then you can create even another option to export. So let's say maybe a low quality PNG or JPEG. It's going to tell me it's been duplicated because the slice already has the same naming convention, so it's a nice fail-safe solution to show you what's going on there. But from this view, you can export all of these at once by going to export slices. This is going to export everything that's checked in this view, or you can do one by one by clicking on each icon here. So for instance, if I want to export everything contained in this blue square, I'd click this icon. Otherwise, I'd click each of these to do the same thing for just that boundary. So that's super powerful in my opinion, and you can add actual custom slicing names, all these things. You can create little variables to create dynamic exporting. Then on top of that, once you export once to a folder, you can enable this continuous export. So each time you make an update to your document within the exports themselves, you can constantly see that folder update with these new slices, which is a nice feature to have. So it goes very deep, very detailed, but I just wanted to show this off. So if I were to slice this, I have a new folder, say slices, create, export that. So here's the really low quality version. Here's the higher quality version. Here's the 2x version. So it's awesome. So you can see the power there of that persona. And a lot of those features exist in Illustrator too, but they're not quite as feature rich, and you have to kind of know what you're doing to do it well. So there is a drop down panel in the file menu you can't see right now, but you can export for screens. You can export as any file type. I think there's up to 16 to choose from. And then there's a save for web option. So exporting for screens gives you this dialog that is similar to what we just saw in Affinity Designer persona, where you would have all the different formats and the scales and suffixes you wanted to add. You can create different formats, of course, as well, and then just export all those things to an actual folder and have them ready to go. All of that's great, but you still have to do that manually for each document, and there's no persona just to have that all enabled by default. Exporting as gives you this other dialog where you can export all these things, and even like an AutoCAD drawing, which is something I'll probably never use, but it's crazy that you can export it. You can export each artboard as well, which is nice. And then there's the legacy save for web. Export, save for web, and this is the interface I remember being completely used to when I first started using Illustrator and Photoshop, where you would have this 2-up variant where you could see things that are in their original state and optimized state, and then you can export them as either named presets or just a different file type. All of that's possible still. It is a legacy thing that they've probably are going to do away with, I'm thinking, but that still exists today, which is the one I end up choosing since I'm just used to it when and if I use the app. I find myself just still using a designer in photo way more these days. So I think that does it. There's so many other things I probably missed in terms of feature sets. There's a lot under the hood in both apps. Both have their own unique qualities, but all in all, I would say if you're transitioning from Illustrator, you'll find Affinity Designer to be right up your alley in terms of the workflow and processes under the hood. Key commands are very similar as well, though they are different in terms of simple things like duplicating a layer. It's Command J over in Designer or Command D over in Illustrator, I think. Other than that, getting used to just the workflow, the key commands, the naming conventions is something that takes maybe a week or two. It took me a little bit to get used to, but I found that all in all, the app responds really well to my own style, and especially illustration. It's one of those things I really love about Affinity Designer, especially that pen tool. That thing is probably my favorite feature under the hood for this app, because it just has everything bundled in one, and it's just easy to use and fluid, and it lets you to be creative, which ultimately is the whole point. So I would definitely check that out. Hopefully you enjoy this comparison. I'll probably do one for Affinity Photo next and Photoshop, maybe just to compare those two. If you have questions or anything about Designer and maybe you're coming from Illustrator, I'd love to help you answer those. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.